Oh, you were right.
Huh?
He's grinding his teeth.
Yeah.
And there's something else. If you drive up north, Steele's where he used to drive. This is the people. You never see it. It's a burn. It's very weird. I ran into a kid show up in John's.
My drivers and was like, we have a friend of mine, but he's not.
Ready?
He's
Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to our second installment, To Live as a Jew. Last class, we discussed how living as a Jew meant living in accordance with God's commandments directed specifically to the Jewish people. All of humanity was also given a mission. If we have to summarize their mission in just a few words, their mission is to civilize the world, which many people would identify as tikkun olam. That's not the Jewish mission. That is the human, universal mission to make the world a perfect world, meaning a civilized world, a world in which we feel comfortable living. That's before we create a world, a divine world, a world in which God feels comfortable. God could not feel comfortable living in a world if we're not comfortable, if we're not at peace, if we still have people who openly state their desire to annihilate the entire Jewish people. That's not a civilized world. And that's why one of the prerequisites for the coming of Mashiach, Maimonides mentions, is fighting a war. Why do you have to fight a war? Because you can't have universal peace and holiness and godliness in a world where you have barbarians, savages. Actually, those words are inadequate to describe what these people do and are. So the first thing, you need society, civilization, to decry that kind of behavior and say this is not the way a civilized world behaves. Then comes the Jewish obligation, in addition to the fact that Jews are also part of society at large, so we have to civilize the world as well, but we have an added obligation to make the world a dwelling place for God. God should feel comfortable in this world by making everything we do revolve around God, revolve around observing His commandments. We already discussed that basic principle, why we have to fulfill the commandments, because that's how we make the world God designed it to be, the world in which He feels comfortable. I'd like to continue with different objectives of a mitzvah, because Judaism revolves around mitzvot, if you want to use the Sephardic pronunciation. And what is a mitzvah? A mitzvah is a commandment, but a mitzvah is also a bond. The Hebrew word mitzvah is related to a root that means to bind together. A mitzvah is what enables us to bind to God. Why do you need a mitzvah to bind to God? What happens if I decide that I'm going to feel connected to God just by virtue of how I feel? That's very nice. The feelings are nice, but that doesn't connect you to God in and of itself, because how could a finite human being in his or her best moments ever connect to an infinite God? You need to find a bridge between God and us. The bridge is the mitzvah. The famous analogy given is, you have Einstein is working in his laboratory thinking of the theory of relativity, and you have this janitor who is illiterate They have virtually nothing in common, although there's no such thing as two human beings have nothing in common, but that's the best kind of analogy we can bring to describe the way we are nothing in relation to God. So this janitor has no bond with Einstein because Einstein is in a world of physics, astrophysics, and this janitor is in a world of sweeping. But Einstein gets thirsty. He's human, so he gets thirsty, and he says to the janitor, could you do me a favor and get me a glass of water? That created a bond. Einstein needed this janitor's services. The very fact that he asked him to do this for him created the bond. And the bond becomes solidified when he actually brings the glass of water. Every time God gives us a commandment, that itself means that God has created a bridge between his infinite being and our very finite being. God says, in a certain sense, I need you to do this for me. God doesn't need anything, but he chose to need our efforts, and that creates a bond between God and us. And that's the only way you could connect. You can make up your own ideas, and that's nice. God gives you reward for your good intentions. But good intentions alone cannot create that bridge. It has to be mandated by God himself. And that's what a mitzvah does. On a more down-to-earth level, a mitzvah is a form of divine discipline which brings about refinement. A human being is created, as it says in the Torah, like a wild animal. A little child, a little baby, just does whatever it wants. It has no discipline. And the point, and it's cute, when a little baby is wild and undisciplined, we look at the baby and we laugh, it's cute. But the ultimate goal is that that baby should develop into a mature human being. In order to have a discipline, you can either impose your own discipline, in which case it's very unlikely that it'll succeed, because not every person responds to every type and every form of discipline. I mean, if you ever read books by different doctors about how to raise your children, they go from one extreme to another. What was it, Dr. Spock? Who else is there? There are others, and they disagree because and it's because you can't really establish one system of discipline that will work for everyone. It doesn't work. Every human being is different, and it's not to say that he was wrong about his approach, or the other doctors are right. Some people are right for one situation, and some people are right for another situation. In order to have a discipline that works for everyone, it has to be designed by someone who knows everyone, who understands the needs, the lacks, the deficiencies of every human being and what they will respond to. So a mitzvah is God's form of discipline. Because human beings go to extremes when it comes to discipline. We go from one extreme to another. Extreme permissiveness to extreme rigidity. And then we decide, you know what, they were both wrong, so we then go to the middle, and then the Torah is always in the middle. It always gives us the right balance. Every mitzvah, how many mitzvahs are there? 613. And they're divided into two categories. And how many are positive? Does anyone remember the number?
365.
No. 248 positive, do's. How many don'ts? 365. So the Talmud says that the number 248 corresponds to the number of bones in our body. And the number 365, the Talmud says, corresponds to the days of the year, of the solar year. But the Zohar says that 365 relates to 365 Giddim. How to translate Giddim is not so simple. It could either mean sinews, blood vessels, but there's something in the body that corresponds to 365. What is the reason why there are 613 mitzvahs? Because every mitzvah connects to one part of our body. that God designed the mitzvahs to relate specifically to one part of who we are. And only God knows exactly who we are and what we consist of, and He designed that every mitzvah corresponds to every aspect of our physical body and of our spiritual selves as well. So a mitzvah is a bond. A mitzvah is also a form of discipline that refines us. But a mitzvah is also the most liberating experience. As you learned in the other class about the soul is a part of God that's sent into this physical world, housed in a physical body. In the sense, the soul is a hostage. Our souls are in prison because the soul wants nothing less than to express its desire to be reconnected to its source. It doesn't want to be here in this physical world in and of itself because it takes it away, it distracts it from its true essence. So the soul is a captive, is a hostage in a body. And even if you're a tzaddik, you're the most righteous person that ever lived, the soul of the righteous person before it comes into this world is much more pure than the soul that comes into the physical world. This physical world, the body and the world at large, dims the light of the soul. But the soul wants to be liberated. How is it liberated? By doing a mitzvah. Every time we do a mitzvah, the soul is able to detach itself from the physical existence and be reconnected to its source. The Midrash gives a parable, a very famous parable, of a princess who falls in love with a gardener, and she elopes. The father disowns her. She elopes. She moves away to the farm, and the gardener was a peasant, illiterate. He knows nothing else but gardening, but agriculture. And after a while, the love wears off, and the princess gives a sigh, utters a sigh, because she's missing the life of her royal existence when she was in the palace of the king, her father. And the husband was sensitive to his wife's needs, and he notices that she's not happy. So what does he think? He thinks, you know what? She probably wants more potatoes. So he digs up all his potatoes and he brings it to his wife, and he thinks she's going to be kvelling, really excited by all these potatoes. And nothing happens. So he says, you know what? It's not potatoes. It must be turnips. And we go on from potatoes to turnips to carrots to onions, and nothing works. And now he's exasperated. He tried everything. He can't imagine what else could she possibly want, because in his peasant mind, that's all that existed were vegetables. And finally, when he expresses his exasperation to his wife, the princess, she says, the problem is you wouldn't even understand what I want and what I need, because I'm a princess and you're a peasant. The body is the peasant. The soul is the princess. The princess was sent into this physical world, and the body covers up its light, and the soul feels pain, feels this emptiness, because it wants to be back in the palace. So what happens? The soul utters a sigh, and the conscious mind picks up that sigh and says, you know what? I'm not happy. You know what? We call that midlife crisis. And I need a new car, a sports car. That's going to make me happy. And that's why every man, when he reaches 40, buys a sports car. Not quite every man, and not just sports cars, but whatever it is, a midlife crisis, and you don't have to be a man to have a midlife crisis, and you don't have to be in midlife to have a midlife crisis. There's times during one's life, whoever he or she is, when you feel an emptiness. That feeling doesn't come because you're lacking something material. It's not because of some physical reason. It's because the soul feels that it's a hostage and it wants to get out. And the only way to satisfy the soul is by doing a mitzvah. And that enables the soul to achieve what its purpose living in this world is all about. It's about climbing a mountain. You know, people like to climb mountains. Why do they climb mountains?
The challenge.
Because it's there. It's the challenge. The truth is, it's because the soul wants to climb a mountain, a spiritual mountain. But the soul expresses itself through the body, and the body thinks it wants adventure. So we go bungee jumping, we go mountain climbing, we do all these crazy things to meet all these challenges, and that's what makes us feel good, but only temporarily, because it's the soul that wants to climb a different kind of a mountain. A variation of this is hunger. The body can't exist without food. That's how God created us. He could have created us that we didn't need food, but He created us that we need food to survive. And when we don't have food, we feel hunger. If we wouldn't feel the hunger, many of us wouldn't survive. We have feeling of hunger. That feeling of hunger reflects a different kind of hunger that the soul feels. The soul needs food. It needs to be nourished. It needs to be nurtured. And the reason why people are depressed and anxious, there might be many reasons for it, but underlying all those reasons that a psychologist will talk to you about and tell you why this person is depressed, why this person is anxious. But deep down, it's because the soul is not fed. The soul is not nourished. The soul feels it's starving. And the only time the soul will get rid of that feeling of emptiness and depression is when it's fed. And the food for a soul, the only food for the soul, is a mitzvah. Now, when I say mitzvah, I'm using it in the broadest of terms. A mitzvah does not just mean fulfillment of a divine commandment. It's study of Torah, which happens to be a commandment as well. So technically, it wouldn't be outside of the realm of mitzvah, but it's a different kind of mitzvah, this using the mind, a mitzvah that engages the mind. Other mitzvahs engage the body, the physical body. Then you have prayer, which engages the heart, the feelings. Whenever we involve ourselves in any of these things, the soul feels nurtured. When the soul is not nurtured, the soul is growling. It's just uncomfortable. On a deeper level, and this is in response to a question, if the soul, when it comes down into this world, is a hostage and is limited by the body, then why did God put the soul in this world? So the simple answer, well, it's the ultimate answer, is that God wants us to fulfill a mission. It's like taking a soldier, taking a very healthy young person and sending them into the army. When they're in the army, they can't advance their education because they're training to fight and they're fighting. But there's a mission to fulfill. And you have to sometimes sacrifice your own interest to fulfill the mission. So in that sense, the reason why God put the soul in this world is because God had a mission for the soul to make the world a dwelling place for God, to make the world a godly place. But that means that the soul is losing. The soul is sacrificing its own interest for a higher purpose. So be it. That's why, God has the right to demand of a soul whatever He wants to demand of it. But the truth is that it's not at the expense of the soul. In fact, the soul's potential can only be realized when it's in this physical world. It's like an actor on the stage. An actor has talent, has artistic talent, but they can only realize their talent, their potential, when they're on the stage, when they're performing. They could study acting, they could know everything about it, they have the talent, but it's latent, it's covered up. In order to realize their true potential, they have to be on a stage. And they need props, they need an audience, and that brings out the deepest powers of their potential that they could not have realized if they didn't have a stage. The soul is the actor. This physical world is the stage. And therefore, when the soul comes into this world, and the mitzvahs that the soul does brings the soul's potential to fulfillment. Without the mitzvah, without being on this stage and performing, and the performance is the act of the mitzvah, without the performance, the soul's potential remains dormant and remains hidden. It's like you have a child, and the child is brilliant, IQ of 180, but the child is not given any stimulus. The child goes to school, and the teacher is teaching basic stuff, and the child is bored, and no one takes the child under his wings. And what happens? That brilliant child turns out to be an ordinary person, doesn't really achieve much, because they were not given the right stage, the right props, the right audience, the right environment. The right environment for the Jew is the environment in which we can do a mitzvah. It's an expression of the Talmud of going down in order to go up. Sometimes when we want to make a gesture of going up, we'll go down first and then we go up. So in that sense, the going down is considered to be part of going up. The soul comes into this world, it's going down. It's going to a lower level. Jacob, we just read yesterday, Jacob leaves Beersheba, that's the holy city in Israel. Beersheba means the well of seven. Kabbalists refer to it as the reservoir of spiritual energy. And where does he go? He goes to Haran. Haran, the word Haran is related to a word that means anger, wrath. So Jacob goes from a holy place to a place of anger and wrath and hostility and challenge and adversity, because the ultimate goal is to elevate the world, but in doing so, your own soul becomes elevated to a higher level. A mitzvah is a physical act, but every mitzvah generates spiritual energy. And this energy never dissipates. You could light a fire and there's smoke, but after a while the smoke dissipates. It's gone. But when you do a mitzvah, that energy never leaves. So what happens to it? It's stored in a bank. It's stored. Because if we would feel the spiritual energy that we generate, we would be so uplifted all the time, we would have no more challenges. We wouldn't have free choice. If every person would appreciate and feel the power, the spiritual power that they generate by doing a mitzvah, you would be on cloud 9 all the time. You wouldn't have to take drugs to be on a high. It's the greatest high. And there are people who do feel that high. But generally speaking, we don't feel the high. Most of the time, people feel the high when they get into Judaism, when they start doing mitzvahs. People who are raised that way and do it their whole life don't feel the same high that a person who's an initiate, who's just starting, who's beginning the journey. And that's because God wants us to have a challenge. That's why we always look up at people who have less spiritual advancement, because they really feel what they're accomplishing. There are people who go to the Western Wall, for example, and they're so inspired by it. And there are people who go there every day, and they're not inspired. That's because their challenge is to be able to get inspiration even when they're so used to it, they're inured to it. But whenever we do a mitzvah, we generate that spiritual energy, and we reap the dividends of it even today. We get some of it. Everyone is influenced somehow by every mitzvah that he or she does. When Mashiach comes, we will get the totality of it, will be revealed to us. We'll open up our bank accounts. The bank accounts will not be sealed anymore, and we'll feel that spiritual energy. A mitzvah we don't do because of reward, ideally. You do a mitzvah because it's the right thing to do. God asks us to do it. But God doesn't cheat us. God doesn't even withhold reward of even an animal. It says in the Torah that when the Jews left Egypt, the dogs did not bark. And God rewarded the dogs. that when you have non-kosher meat, it says in the Torah, throw it to the dogs. Let the dogs eat it. Because we can't eat it, so we'll give it to the dogs. So the Talmud says that was the reward that God gave the dogs for not barking at the time of the Exodus. And the Talmud has an expression, God does not withhold the reward from any creature. There's no question, though we shouldn't be doing it for the reward, we should know that there is a reward, and we will all get that reward. Some of it we get in this world. Sometimes, especially when you do something good for other people, which is a mitzvah, of course, you get a reciprocation of that good in this world. You feel you get some reward, get a favor in return. Again, that's not the reason you should do it, but that's something that you should expect that's going to happen. But every mitzvah we do generates reward, and the greatest reward is spiritual pleasure. To a very unsophisticated person, the only type of pleasure they know is physical pleasure, sensual pleasure. If you're on a more sophisticated level, you'll appreciate beautiful music. If you're more sophisticated, you'll appreciate and get a lot of satisfaction out of a deep concept. But that's still not spiritual. The deepest pleasure that a human being could appreciate is the spiritual pleasure that you can only get by generating that pleasure through the mitzvah that you do. Another thing about a mitzvah, especially relevant in the present time when we're in a struggle, a life and death struggle for the survival of Israel, and by extension the survival of the Jewish people. We know we're going to survive. That's not the issue. The issue is at what expense. We never doubt in our minds that we are going to survive. We're going to outlive the enemies. They will all be a footnote in history, if even that, and we're going to be strong. But we know that, tragically, our immortality comes at the expense of individual suffering, sometimes large numbers, as in the Holocaust. And even now, these are incredibly large numbers that it's hard for us to wrap our minds around the number of Jews that were massacred. But we know we're going to win. We know we're going to overcome. But how do we protect one another? How do Jews protect one another? And the answer is by doing a mitzvah and having in mind that we're doing the mitzvah, of course, primarily because this is what God wants us to do, regardless of the consequences. But a mitzvah is also a power that strengthens one another, because all of the Jewish people are connected. And we cement that connection by doing a mitzvah. So when a woman lights her Shabbat candles before the onset of Shabbat, before sunset, she is connected to all Jewish women in the whole world. And of all Jewish women that ever lived, that ever lit Shabbat candles. And that generates such powerful, not just physical light, but spiritual light, that it dispels darkness. When a man puts on tefillin, one of the characteristics of tefillin is that it empowers us. It strengthens our mind, our arms, our heart. It strengthens us spiritually, and it has the power that it could affect Jews all over the world. And ultimately, the mitzvahs that we do will bring us liberation and bring us the redemption. As I mentioned, it's also the most unifying aspect that we have. What unifies Jews is doing a mitzvah. And this is something that's going on in Israel. It's unbelievable the degree to which Jews are inspired today because of this terrible tragedy. Jews who are starting to keep Shabbat, Jews who are putting on tefillin, who are wearing tzitzis, mezuzahs on the doorposts. There's a shortage of tefillin and mezuzahs in Israel, I heard. And it's just an incredible thing. It brings Jews together. Another simple way of looking at a mitzvah is that society is very much today into identity, identifying who you are. People are very sensitive about their identities, sometimes in a very not a very sensible way, but people are very much about identity. A Jew has to have something with which he or she identifies himself or herself. I don't know if I should mention this anecdote, but I'll mention it because I said I teased you. But there was this rabbi who did not believe in God, who was an atheist, but he was extremely observant. He put on tefillin every day. He had a mezuzah on his door. He did everything. He kept kosher. He kept Shabbat, but didn't believe in God and didn't believe the Torah was divine or anything like that. So someone asked him, if you don't believe in anything, why are you doing all these things? So he said, this is what he said, I'm not saying it. He said, could you ever think of an American Indian without feathers? That's how they identify. Well, a Jew identifies with mitzvahs. That part he happens to be right. I don't know about the feathers, but for certain, a Jew identifies with a mitzvah. That's our ID. And every person needs to have an identity. That's our uniform, if you will. When you buy a computer, you should check on how the computer operates, the manufacturer's specs as to how it operates, or any machine for that matter. This world was designed by God to work in a certain way. If we don't like the orders that the manufacturer put into the computer, then we're not going to have a computer. It's going to break down. Society cannot function unless it has the correct specs, the specifications for its operation. And that's what a mitzvah is. That's how the world is supposed to operate. If we don't do mitzvahs, the world is going to be an upside-down world. I think I used this analogy before. There was a professor, his name was Velvel Green. He worked for NASA. And he was working on a project of visiting one of the closest stars, Alpha Centauri. And the way that we can reach that star, based on the way we have the spaceships we have now, is it's going to take about 900 years or so. So you're going to have a couple in the spaceship who's going to have children, and the children will have children, and they're going to have descendants, and generations later they'll reach that star. But there's a problem. What happens when 800 years into the trip, someone decides, why are we going in this direction? Let's make a left turn. And the entire project of 800 years goes down the drain. So that was one of the issues they were grappling with. I mean, I can think of more important things than to grapple on how to reach Alpha Centauri in 800 years, 900 years. But this is what they were talking about. And this professor, Velvel Green, who was an atheist, became a Chabad follower, a very devout Chabad chassid. And this is one of the things that hit him, saying, you know what, that's exactly, Judaism was given to us 3,300 years ago, and it's an itinerary. It's taking us to an intended result at the end, and 3,000 years later, we're almost there, and someone decides, you know what, who says we have to keep the Torah? Who says we have to fulfill commandments? We can go in a different direction. You mess up the whole journey. God designed this world, and He put us on this itinerary, and that's what the mitzvah is all about, is fulfilling the directions that God gave us. And finally, we have the idea of meaning. People want to have meaning in life. People don't want to live their lives thinking that there's no purpose in what I'm doing. I just heard on the radio, someone was saying about that all summer long they play golf in the north, then they go to Arizona for all summer just the opposite. I don't think you go to Arizona in the summer. And they go to the Arizona in the winter, and they play golf, and then they go north in the summer to play golf. I really feel bad for these people. Their whole life revolves around playing golf. If that's all they have in their life, they're going to be the most miserable people. People cannot tolerate not having meaning and purpose in their lives. And that's why you find very often Hollywood people are always involved in some kind of a cause. Why do they have to be involved in a cause? Because they realize their lives, all the glamour and all the glitter and all the fame and all the power and all the wealth doesn't put any meaning into their lives. So they're looking and searching to have some meaning. Sometimes they find the right causes to follow. Sometimes they get into the wrong causes, as we're seeing today. Some of them are pro-Hamas in one form or another, and some are against. We have to realize that both of them are motivated by the same thing. They want to have purpose and meaning in their lives. All this is an introduction to practical Judaism. So we're going to talk about getting up in the morning. That's the first thing we usually do in the morning. We get up. Some of us are still sleeping, but most of us hopefully get up in the morning. What is the first thing we do when we wake up in the morning? As soon as we're conscious, before we get out of bed, before we do anything, we say the prayer Moda Ani, which is thanksgiving. People who ask, do we observe Thanksgiving? Oh boy, do we observe Thanksgiving every single day, many times during the day, besides all the holidays that we have. Thanksgiving is the essence of being Jewish. The word Jew, we should tell the anti-Semites, comes from a root that means thankfulness. The word Jew comes from Yehuda. Yehuda was the fourth son of Jacob, whose mother, Leah, named him Yehuda because she says, now I'm going to thank God because of what he gave me another son. So the word Jew means to be grateful, to show gratitude. And the first thing we do in the morning, we say Moda Ani. And as I mentioned in another class a few years ago, we don't say Ani Moda, I thanks, as we do in English. See, the English syntax turns it around. The English syntax is I offer thanks to you. In the Hebrew, it's thanks I offer. The I is not there. The I comes second. The thanks comes first, because that's the essence of gratitude. The essence of gratitude is the acknowledgement of the other. And there are different degrees of how we acknowledge an other. Sometimes we acknowledge ourselves. Yes, I'm here and everything revolves around me, but I admit there's something else out there. I got a little help. Bar Kokhba, the famous general who was almost, people thought he was the Mashiach because he was winning battles against the Romans. What was his downfall? His downfall is what he said to God, God, don't help me, just don't hinder me. You know, I recognize you have a role, but I can do it myself. That's like the guy who was looking for the parking space, and an important meeting at 9 o'clock, it's 5 to 9, and all the places are taken. He says, God, I'll give $10,000 to charity. And then someone pulls out right in front of the entrance, and he goes right in, God, I took care of it myself. But true gratitude is where the object of your gratitude comes first, and then you come second. And here you have the Modani, if you have it transliterated, so you can use this if you can't read the Hebrew, and repeat it, recite it every morning until you memorize it, then you won't need to read it. And what we say is, I offer thanks to you, living and eternal King, for you have mercifully restored my soul within me. Your faithfulness is great. That means we trust God that he's going to give us back our soul. We deliver our soul to him in the morning, at night, before we go to bed, and God gives us back our soul. So we say, God, you were faithful. You kept your word. There's a deeper understanding of this. When we wake up in the morning, it's a model of, it's a portent of the resurrection of the dead. That means just like God gives us back our soul every morning, which he doesn't have to do, God could say, you know what, I took your soul at night and I'm decided to keep it. God says, no, I'm giving it back to you. The same way, we know that in the future, God will return the souls even to those who are no longer alive. Now, if you notice, in this prayer, God's name is not mentioned. God's name is not mentioned. We call him the living and eternal King, but we don't say God, the living and eternal King. Because this prayer we say even before we wash our hands, before our bodies are clean. Because there's a certain, and that's why we can't use God's name. It's not proper etiquette and respect to God to utter his name when we're not clean, physically clean. But there's a deeper understanding of it, that there's a part of our soul that no matter how unclean we may be, there's a part of our soul at the core that is pure and holy. The Moda Ani represents the core of our soul. Someone once asked the Rebbe's mother, he used to deliver groceries to the Rebbe's mother's house, and he once asked the Rebbe's mother, what's the Rebbe's, your son's, favorite prayer? She says, well, I don't know. I'll ask him. And he said it was Moda Ani. This was the Rebbe's favorite prayer, because this prayer gets to the very core of who we are. There's a lot, we can speak for hours about Moda Ani, but I want to get into some more practical stuff. The next thing we do after reciting Moda Ani is washing our hands. Washing hands is a very integral part of Jewish life. We're always washing. Some people say the reason why Jews suffered less during the bubonic plague is because we wash our hands so much. We have so much contact with physically purifying waters, mikveh and so on, that we were more hygienically protected. So how do we wash our hands in the morning? Because we wash our hands before breaking bread, before eating bread, but we wash our hands in the morning indifferently. We alternate. We hold the container, the cup, in our left hand, and we pour the water on our right hand. You always start with the right. And then we pour to the left, to the right, to the left, to the right, to the left. Total of 6 times. Why do we do it? And why do we alternate? Because when we wash our hands before a meal, we don't alternate. I mean, we do. We wash either 2 times each hand, 2 or 3 times. Chabad custom is to do it 3 times. If I have time, I'll explain why. And then we do the right hand, then we do the left hand, without alternating. But in the morning, we alternate. Why is that? Why do we wash our hands in the morning? The main reason is God is identified with life. Where do you see God's presence? You see God's presence in life. The more vibrant life is, the more God's presence is seen. When a person dies, the Torah says the person is tameh, is ritually unclean. If you touch a dead body, you have to go through a purification process. Does that mean that you're a bad person? No, of course not. It means that you have come in contact with a state of existence in which God's presence is curtailed. And when God's presence is curtailed, it allows impure forces to take residence there. And therefore you have to go through a purification process through water. Water is the source of life. So you correct the imbalance of life by bringing more life. When a person goes to sleep, the Talmud says sleep is a 60th of death. Your soul partially leaves the body, and you're only left with digestive and certain physical functions, but your mind isn't operating except in dreaming, which is not really fully operational. So in that sense, we are tameh, we're impure. That means we're in a state where God's presence is by God's own design. He designed it that way, less present, less expressive. When we wake up in the morning, the life comes back to us, so our impurity leaves us, but remains at the edges of our fingers. The fingers, the nails, represent the impure forces, or the least. The nails are alive, but they're dead as well. We can cut our nails without pain. So it means it's the part of the body that is the least alive. And that's where there's still a vestige of impurity left. And by pouring the water, we remove that impurity. So why do we alternate? Because the impure forces, when you pour water on them, they run away to the next hand. And when you pour water on there, they run back to the first hand. They keep on going in different directions. So we tackle it in different directions. That's the reason given. So that's the next thing that we do. Now, when you wash your hands, there's a blessing that's recited. Now, since we're still not physically clean, we have to still relieve ourselves, we have to wash ourselves, more than just washing our fingertips. So after we go to the bathroom, we wash again, and then we recite the blessing that's mentioned here on page 7. The end of the blessing is Al Nitilat Yadayim, for washing our hands, which is the same blessing we recite when we wash our hands before a meal. We also recite that in the morning. So those are the 2 things. The Moda Ani, before we wash our hands, and the washing of our hands, which we actually do twice, and reciting that blessing. We thank God for the commandment that He gave us to wash our hands. Now, before a meal, we also wash our hands, but for different reasons. The primary reason for washing our hands, it's interesting, before a meal, is that in biblical times, likewise when the temple stood, even post-biblical, a Jew who lived in Israel was required to give a tithe produce to the Kohen, to the priest. That was their way of supporting themselves through these tithes. And only the priest could eat it. It's called truma. Only a priest can eat truma. No one else could eat it. A priest can feed it to his family members, but no one else outside could eat it. Truma was holy, and therefore, if his hands were ritually not clean, he wasn't allowed to eat the truma. So we had to wash his hands to purify his hands so that he should be allowed to eat the truma. But since people are not used to doing things, the rabbis instituted that everyone should wash their hands, even if you're not a Kohen, even if you're not eating truma, even if there is no longer truma because we no longer have the holy temple, and until Mashiach comes, we will not be required to give truma. Although in Israel they do separate truma and other tithes, but they don't give it to a Kohen. It's burnt because it's not ritually clean, so no one could eat it. But at any rate, we believe that we will soon be going back to the truma when our hands have to be ritually clean. So it's a way of cleansing ourselves in preparation for the future. And therefore we wash our hands. Another reason why we wash our hands in the morning is it's when the priest would come to the holy temple, the first thing the priest would have to do is wash hands. Actually, they would wash their feet as well. It's a way of saying, I am preparing myself for a day of service to God. So when we wake up in the morning, we also want to say to God, God, we're ready to serve you. We're ready to take on the day and do whatever we have to do. And we're purifying ourselves in that pursuit. There's also a third reason given, a very practical reason. When a person is asleep, they can't control the movements of their hands, and they might have touched parts of their body that aren't clean. So you have to remove that impurity, the physical impurity. So it's both a removal of spiritual impurity and physical impurity. Any questions?
What about Reishis Hakma right after you left?
Some people say that, yes. Chabad doesn't say that. No. But there's a lot more to say and to do. We're just starting off.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
So you had said in an earlier class that it doesn't matter if you know what you're doing in terms of doing a mitzvah. The important thing is to do a mitzvah. Like, does it generate the same spiritual?
No, that's not 100% true. It makes a big difference. But the most important part of the mitzvah is the act. Secondarily, it's the intention. If you want to generate and feel the spirituality, you need the intention, you need the feeling. But if you have a choice of doing a mitzvah in your mind, meditating on the mitzvah, and not doing it, and you feel very emotional, you feel very inspired, or doing the mitzvah without the inspiration, do the mitzvah. That's the most important part of the mitzvah, the act itself. But of course, especially in Hasidic teachings, there's tremendous emphasis placed on the feelings. So I don't want to be misunderstood that the feelings are not important. They're very important. And when you put the action with the feeling together, you have a much more powerful force. But if you have a choice of one or the other, or you're just lazy, just do the mitzvah. That's the most important part. Any other questions? Okay. Have a little break.